God chose me to be a preacher. Y'all think I want to be a preacher? You think I want to? I don't get paid from preaching. Y'all think I want to? No, I have to follow my calling. Because let me tell y'all something of who Bishop Whitehead is, right? Let me tell you who Bishop Whitehead is. Bishop Whitehead is going to say it like he want to say it, and I'm going to tell it like it is, because I ain't scared of none of y'all.
Chapter 1. The Image, the Promise, and the First Red Flag. He didn't just preach success, he wore it, filmed it, and turned it into proof. And before you decide what you think about him, stay with this story, because the image came first, not the truth. Before the scandals, before the lawsuits, before the viral clips that spread across the internet, there was an image. A carefully constructed image designed to make people stop asking questions. Because when someone looks successful enough, most people never think to ask how they got there. They assume the result must be earned. They assume the story must be real. And they assume the man standing at the pulpit knows something they don't. This is not a story about religion. It's a story about power, persuasion, and what happens when belief slowly turns into a transaction. In Brooklyn, New York, Bishop Lamor Whitehead made himself impossible to ignore. Designer suits, luxury cars, diamond chains, a social media presence that blended sermons with status symbols. He didn't hide his wealth. He showcased it. He framed it as evidence of divine favor, a living testimony that faith works if you follow the right leader. Now think about this. If someone looks successful before you ever hear their message, how much easier is it to believe what they're saying? To many people watching, he didn't look like a pastor. He looked like a brand. And that distinction matters more than most people realize. Because in the modern age, influence isn't built quietly, it's built visually. Bishop Whitehead understood something crucial. If people see prosperity first, they stop asking for proof later. The image does the persuading before the words even land. His message wasn't subtle. God wants you to win. God wants you to rise. God wants you to have more. And if you want what he has, you need to listen to him. That message lands very differently when it comes from someone wearing a modest suit. But when it comes from someone stepping out of a Rolls Royce, it feels convincing. That's not coincidence. That's psychology. People associate wealth with competence. They associate confidence with truth. And they associate visibility with legitimacy. When all three appear together, skepticism shuts down. Most viewers don't analyze, they admire. Be honest with yourself for a moment. Have you ever trusted someone more just because they look successful? This is where the first red flag appears. Faith traditions have historically emphasized humility, restraint, and service. Yet, here was a man presenting luxury as a spiritual achievement. Not something to be cautious of, but something to celebrate. Not a distraction, but a destination. And if you're struggling financially, that message hits differently. It feels like hope with a face. It feels like proof that your life can change overnight. And when you're desperate for change, you don't analyze the messenger. You cling to the promise. This is how persuasion begins. Church services became more than sermons. They became performances. Cameras were rolling. Clips were edited. Reactions were tracked. The message spread far beyond the walls of the building, and with every repost, every comment, every view, the image grew stronger. But here's something most people don't consider. Images demand maintenance. When authority is built on appearance, it must constantly be reinforced. The suits have to get sharper. The cars have to get bigger. The lifestyle has to stay impressive. Because the moment the image cracks, the illusion starts to fail. At that point, the question quietly changes. It's no longer, is this right? It becomes, how do I keep this going? That shift is everything. Because ministry turns into management, faith turns into optics, and belief starts serving the image instead of guiding behavior. Comment below. At what point do you think success stops being a blessing and starts becoming bait? Another red flag shows up in how criticism is handled. When people question the displays of wealth, the response wasn't transparency. It was deflection. Critics were dismissed as jealous. Skeptics were labeled negative. Doubters were accused of lacking faith. That tactic is not accidental. Once questioning is framed as a moral failure, control is established. People stop speaking up. They stop trusting their instincts. And when that happens, accountability disappears. This is where belief turns into leverage. Behind the scenes, stories like this don't grow by accident. They grow through emotional alignment. People don't follow leaders like this because of theology alone. They follow because the leader represents something they want: certainty, security, confidence, and control. When someone stands on a stage and says, "I was chosen," it creates distance. When they say, "You can be chosen too," it creates loyalty. And loyalty is powerful currency. Let me ask you something. Would you have questioned him at this stage, or would you have trusted the image? Because most people don't fall for scams. They fall for narratives. They fall for certainty. They fall for someone who looks like they already won. This is why the opening chapter of this story matters. Not because of what we know now, but because of what people believed then. They believed they were watching a man favored by God. They believed his success was evidence. They believed proximity to him meant proximity to blessing. And once that belief takes root, people give more than money. They give trust, and trust becomes the most valuable asset of all. So before we go any further, keep this question in your mind. If someone's authority depends entirely on their image, what happens when that image starts to collapse? Because in the next chapter, we're going back to the beginning, before the suits, before the fame, to understand how this story was built, long before anyone was watching. If you're finding this breakdown valuable, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what comes next. Chapter 2: Origins, Trauma, and the Making of a Persuader. Every powerful image has an origin story, and the most convincing ones begin with pain, because pain earns trust before questions ever appear. Before the designer suits, before the luxury cars, before the viral sermons and public controversy, there was a narrative about struggle. A story meant to explain not just who he was, but why he should be listened to. And like many stories built around influence, this one didn't start with success. It started with tragedy. Pause for a moment, because origin stories shape everything that comes after. According to publicly shared accounts, Lamor Whitehead experienced loss very early in life. The kind of loss that doesn't just affect a family, but reshapes identity. When someone grows up with trauma, it often becomes the lens through which they see the world. For some, it becomes fuel. For others, it becomes justification. And sometimes, it becomes branding. Think about this. When someone tells you they came from nothing, are you more likely to trust them? That's not accidental. Stories of hardship create instant credibility. They disarm skepticism. They make people root for the speaker. Because struggle feels honest. It feels earned. and it feels relatable. As he grew older, the narrative expanded. There was talk of potential, intelligence, athletic ability, opportunity, the suggestion that he wasn't ordinary, that he was destined for more. This part of the story matters because it frames later behavior not as greed, but as fulfillment. It subtly tells the audience, this was always meant to happen. Early ambition is often praised. Hustle culture rewards it, and in environments where resources are limited, ambition can feel like survival. There's nothing inherently wrong with that, but ambition without boundaries can quietly morph into entitlement. At some point, the story shifts toward business, finance, deals, the language of leverage and access. This is where a critical transformation happens, because once someone learns how systems work, they also learn how systems can be exploited. Let's slow down here. Knowing how money moves isn't a crime. Knowing how credit works isn't wrong. But when persuasion meets opportunity, a new skill set is formed. The ability to convince. The ability to sell certainty. The ability to make promises sound inevitable. Ask yourself this: do the most convincing people always tell the truth, or do they just sound confident? This phase of the story is important because it's where mindset is shaped. When success becomes something you can talk your way into, the line between earning and extracting starts to blur. And then comes the turning point that ties everything together: the calling. At some point, the narrative introduces ministry, not as a casual interest, but as destiny, as a higher purpose, as something unavoidable. This is where the story gains moral armor. Because once someone says they were called, disagreement starts to feel like disrespect. Questioning feels like opposition to something sacred, and accountability becomes harder to enforce. Here's why that matters. A calling doesn't just explain behavior, it excuses it. Think about this carefully. How often have you heard someone justify questionable actions by saying they were led or chosen? Once authority is framed as divine, human rules start to feel optional. This is where the foundation of persuasion is fully set. Trauma creates sympathy. Ambition creates admiration. Calling creates immunity. And when those three combine, you don't just get influence, you get followers. But here's the uncomfortable part most people ignore. Not everyone who survives trauma becomes compassionate. Some become controlling. Not everyone who escapes struggle becomes generous. Some become obsessed with never returning to it. Fear of falling back down can be more powerful than faith.
The man that was alleged to commit a crime against a New Yorker, one of, if not the greatest city in the world. And after that, my life changed. Because all the media started to plaster me not as a bishop, but as a black man that was convicted, that has a felony. And nobody else wanted to talk about what Bishop Whitehead has done. So nobody wanted to talk about that the young man turned himself in and surrendered. Everybody wanted to talk about the Bling Bishop that the media portrayed. And then they wanted to go, oh, he was convicted for scheme to defraud, grand larceny. And then, as a black man, they always bring up our past. They always bring up our past. But they don't want to say that Bishop Whitehead was illegally convicted. They don't want to say that they forged search warrants in order to convict me. They don't want to talk about how they hid all the evidence and lied to my attorneys to convict me. But everybody wants to talk about that I went to prison. Typical black man. Let's talk about my father, Arthur Miller, who was killed when I was 6 weeks old, beat and strangled to death by 16 police officers by the 77th precinct. And I had to grow up without a father. I didn't have nobody to teach me how to be a man because of the color of my father's skin. But yet, my church, nobody can empathize or sympathize with us. You want to know why? Because you're plastering their pastor, his past. And nobody wants to talk about these 3 men that came into this church and violated us. We are a house of worship. It doesn't matter if we're black, brown, white, Asian. It doesn't matter. Why are we missing the point? Why isn't it enough media talking about what happened to my church? My wife has not stopped crying. My daughter has not stopped crying yet. My members have not stopped crying yet. Nobody's empathizing with my church. They don't even want to come to church no more. I was on the phone with one of my preachers. He said, Bishop, I'm scared to answer the phone. It just brings so much anxiety. They're beating up on you, Bishop. What are we supposed to do? I'm a black man in America. Every time I get in my car, I don't know if I'm going to come home because we die for less. So today, I want to bring our attention to a few points, and then I'm going to open it for questions. Everybody is setting a narrative that all of this, it was $1 million, it was 400,000, all that's garbage. Nobody can quote that I said any of that. But to sell newspapers and to sell media, y'all put whatever number you want on its face. And I don't get the opportunity to defend myself. $1 million worth of jewelry, then all the tabloids. Why would a pastor have that? What about his congregation? And then you posterize if I wear a Fendi suit or Gucci.
Chapter 3. When faith moves off stage and money enters the room. The most important moments in this story didn't happen on a stage. They happened in private, where belief stopped being inspiration and started becoming leverage. Up to this point, everything had been public. The sermons, the image, the origin story, the confidence. From the outside, it all looked clean, structured, intentional. But persuasion doesn't reach its full power in crowds. It reaches it one-on-one. This is the chapter where everything quietly changes. Because when faith moves off camera, accountability fades. And when money enters private conversations, trust becomes the most valuable currency in the room. Pause here for a second. This distinction matters more than most people realize. Public messages build belief. Private messages close decisions. In environments built around authority, private access feels like privilege. When a spiritual leader pulls someone aside, texts them directly, or calls them personally, it creates the sense that something special is happening, that the relationship is deeper, that guidance is personal. And personal guidance carries weight. Reported accounts connected to this story describe moments where financial discussions didn't happen during sermons or in front of witnesses. They happened quietly, through calls, messages, and closed-door meetings. These weren't framed as transactions. They were framed as help, as opportunity, as favor. Think about this honestly. If someone you believed was spiritually chosen offered to help you financially, would you question them? That's not weakness. That's human psychology. In private conversations, the language shifts. It becomes softer, more reassuring, more specific. I see potential in you. I don't do this for everyone. This is confidential. God put this on my heart. Those phrases don't sound like sales tactics. They sound like care. But they perform the same function. They lower resistance. Once someone believes they've been chosen for special access, the power dynamic changes. The leader is no longer just a guide. He becomes a gatekeeper, and gatekeepers decide who advances and who doesn't. This is where faith and finance collide. In many publicly discussed cases involving alleged religious financial exploitation, the pattern looks familiar. A person in need is identified. Their vulnerability is understood, and then a promise is introduced, not as a risk, but as certainty. Not this might work, but this will work. Certainty is intoxicating, especially when it comes from someone you trust, and trust is built long before money is ever mentioned. Now let's slow this down. Promises made in these environments are rarely written down. Contracts feel too worldly. Paperwork feels unnecessary when trust exists, and questioning details can be framed as doubt. That framing is powerful, because once doubt is moralized, people silence themselves. They ignore their instincts. They suppress red flags. Comment below. Do you think faith should ever require secrecy when money is involved? As time passes, expectations form. Timelines are discussed. Outcomes are implied. And when those outcomes don't arrive, the tone changes. At first, delays are explained away. There's a process. Things take time. Be patient. Then the explanation becomes spiritual. This is a test. The enemy is interfering. Your breakthrough is close. And finally, when pressure increases, the explanation turns defensive. Why are you questioning me? Do you trust God or not? You're letting fear block your blessing. This escalation matters because it shifts responsibility away from the promise maker and onto the believer. If the outcome fails, the failure isn't logistical, it's spiritual, and that's devastating. At this point, many people don't just lose money, they lose confidence in their judgment. They feel ashamed for doubting, embarrassed for believing, and terrified of speaking out. Silence becomes easier than confrontation, and silence allows patterns to continue. Here's the part that's hardest to accept. These situations rarely rely on outright lies. They rely on ambiguity, on implication, on emotional pressure. Nothing has to be guaranteed. It just has to feel inevitable. And inevitability keeps people waiting. Waiting is powerful. Because as long as someone is waiting, they're still invested, still hoping, still loyal. Let me ask you this. At what point should waiting turn into walking away? Because by the time many people realize something is wrong, they've already invested too much to leave easily. They've told family members. They've defended the leader publicly. They've internalized the belief. Admitting deception now would mean admitting loss. And loss hurts more than hope. This is where power dynamics become visible. The leader controls information. He controls access. He controls interpretation. And those under him are left with only belief. Belief without verification is fragile, but belief tied to identity is explosive. As more stories surface publicly, a pattern begins to emerge. Not a single incident, but repeated behavior. Similar promises, similar delays, similar explanations. Patterns don't prove guilt, but they do demand attention. And attention is what these systems resist the most. Because attention brings questions. Questions bring scrutiny. Scrutiny brings collapse. This is why private faith finance interactions are so dangerous. They operate in the shadows of belief, protected by silence and loyalty. And when someone finally speaks out, they're often framed as bitter, ungrateful, or malicious. Their story is questioned. Their motives are attacked. Because attacking the messenger is easier than addressing the message. Pause and reflect for a moment. If a system only works when people stay quiet, is it really a system of faith? As pressure builds, something else begins to happen. The image that once felt untouchable starts attracting attention. Not admiration, but curiosity. And curiosity is the beginning of the end. Because curiosity asks questions. And questions expose gaps. In the next chapter, we're going to look at what happens when private pressure turns public, when cameras capture moments that can't be reframed, and when controversy stops being manageable. If this breakdown is helping you understand how persuasion actually works, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what comes next. This is where the story shifts from quiet influence to viral exposure. Every carefully controlled story eventually meets a moment it can't contain. For this one, it happened. On camera, and millions of people were watching. Up until now, much of what we've talked about lived in private conversations, closed doors, and quiet frustration. Influence works best when it stays contained. But the moment something goes public, control starts to slip. This chapter is where that shift happens. Because once cameras capture a moment that can't be reframed, the image begins to crack. Pause here for a second. This is the turning point. In July of 2022, during a church service that was being live streamed online, something happened that no amount of branding could prepare for. In the middle of the sermon, armed individuals entered the church. Chaos followed. Congregants were terrified. Children were present. Jewelry was taken. The moment was raw, shocking, and real. And within hours, the footage spread everywhere. Think about that. A private religious space suddenly becoming global content. For some viewers, the reaction was sympathy, fear, shock. No one wants to see violence enter a place of worship. But almost immediately, another reaction emerged: suspicion. Not because people lacked empathy, but because the image no longer aligned with the message. Here's why. For years, the bishop's public identity centered on visible wealth, jewelry, luxury, status. And now, that same image was at the center of a violent crime. Suddenly, people weren't just asking what happened. They were asking why. Why was so much wealth being worn during a service? Why did the image feel more like a celebrity event than a church gathering? And why did this moment feel less like random misfortune and more like a spotlight? Be honest. When you first heard about this, did it raise questions for you? This is where the internet does what it does best. Clips were replayed. Screenshots were analyzed. Old videos resurfaced. Comment sections exploded. People didn't just react, they investigated. And when the public investigates, narratives lose their protection. Because online attention doesn't come with loyalty, it comes with curiosity. As coverage grew, something important happened. The robbery stopped being just a crime. It became a symbol. To supporters, it was persecution. Proof that the bishop was targeted. Evidence that success invites attack. To critics, it was exposure. Proof that the image had consequences. Evidence that the lifestyle came with risks that extended beyond the individual. Two completely different interpretations, same event. And that divide matters, because when a leader frames every crisis as spiritual warfare, it strengthens devotion, but weakens accountability. It tells followers to defend, not to examine. At the same time, Outside observers weren't interested in spiritual framing. They were interested in facts, in finances, in history. And that's when past allegations began resurfacing. Public records, previous cases, and unresolved questions were suddenly being discussed widely. Things that once stayed in the background were now front-page material. Let me ask you this. Do you think the robbery revealed something, or did it just force people to look closer? As the bishop responded publicly, the tone was defiant. He positioned himself as a survivor, as someone protected, as someone chosen. And to be fair, surviving a violent event is traumatic. That reality shouldn't be minimized. But here's the tension. Trauma doesn't erase responsibility, and survival doesn't explain everything. When tragedy becomes content, intention matters. In the weeks that followed, the robbery wasn't just discussed, it was reenacted, repeated, reframed, used as proof of divine favor, used as validation of status. That repetition raised even more questions. Because most people who experience trauma want distance from it. They want healing, not headlines. So why keep returning to it? Pause here. This detail is important. When controversy becomes part of branding, it stops being accidental. The robbery may not have been planned, but its aftermath became strategy. It kept attention locked in. It kept followers emotionally charged. And it kept the bishop at the center of conversation. And attention, even negative attention, is powerful currency. At the same time, law enforcement moved forward. Arrests were made. The crime itself was confirmed as real. But confirmation of the crime didn't resolve the deeper questions. In fact, it intensified them. Because once the robbery was validated, the focus shifted fully onto the lifestyle that made it possible. People weren't asking, "Did this happen?" anymore. They were asking, "How did we get here?" That's a dangerous question for any image-based authority figure, because how invites history. History invites patterns. Patterns invite conclusions. And once conclusions form, control is gone. From this point forward, the story was no longer private. It belonged to the public, to journalists, to critics, to analysts, to anyone willing to dig. The stage had expanded, and the spotlight was unforgiving. If you've watched scandals unfold before, you know what comes next. Public pressure forces reactions. Reactions create contradictions. Contradictions attract more attention. And once that cycle starts, it doesn't slow down, it accelerates. Comment below. Do you think the robbery changed the story, or did it just reveal what was already there? Because in the next chapter, we're going to examine what happens after the spotlight turns on, when legal pressure, public scrutiny, and reputation collide. If you're following this series, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next chapter. This is where the story stops being manageable and starts becoming dangerous for everyone involved. And what do you think so far? Was this a turning point? Or was the collapse already inevitable? Chapter 4. When the image meets the courtroom. The spotlight doesn't just expose what people show you, it drags forward everything they hoped you'd never look up. After the robbery pushed this story into the public eye, curiosity turned into scrutiny, and scrutiny doesn't stay on the surface for long. It digs, it pulls records, it connects dots, and once that process begins, the image that once protected a public figure can no longer hold the weight. This chapter isn't about rumors. It's about what happens when stories meet paperwork. Pause here for a moment, because this is where perception collides with reality. As media attention intensified, Reporters and online investigators began revisiting earlier allegations tied to Bishop Lamor Whitehead, past cases, unresolved disputes, and court records that once lived quietly in databases were suddenly being discussed openly. And the contrast was impossible to ignore. On one hand, there was the public persona, luxury suits, confident sermons, proclamations of success and favor. On the other hand, there were reports of lawsuits, unpaid judgments, and financial obligations that told a very different story. That contradiction matters, because real wealth doesn't fear transparency, and genuine success doesn't collapse under basic questions. Ask yourself this honestly. If someone is truly thriving, why are courts repeatedly involved in collecting money? According to publicly reported information, several legal disputes followed a similar pattern: financial promises made, expectations set, and outcomes that never fully materialized. In some cases, individuals claimed they were owed significant sums. In others, companies sought repayment after agreements fell apart. These weren't just misunderstandings over small amounts. They involved six-figure claims, mortgages, loans, judgments. And when those stories surfaced, something interesting happened. The language shifted. Instead of addressing specifics, responses became broader, more defensive. Critics were framed as attackers. Lawsuits were framed as harassment. Accountability was framed as persecution. This framing is strategic, because when a leader casts themselves as the victim, supporters feel compelled to defend them, and defense feels righteous, even when facts are unresolved.
So now all we're asking, help us protect ourselves. Pass a law where we can carry our firearms, because this gun violence has went to a new level.
If you have any words for the robbers, what words would you give them?
If I have any words for the robbers, what would I give them? First of all, I forgive them. The Bible teaches me to forgive. Matthew 6, verse 14, 15 says, if ye forgive your trespasses, then I will forgive you. Then I will forgive you your trespasses. But if you do not forgive your trespasses, then I won't forgive you. So I would say, I forgive you. There's no harm, no hurt, no foul. But the second thing I would say is turn yourself in. What you did was in violation of every code of ethics. Ain't nobody from heaven to the streets that's going to respect you from running into a church of worship. Ain't nobody that have any tough blood in their body gonna respect you from running into the church. Nobody. So turn yourself in. Find your local station, police station, and turn yourself in. And if whoever was behind it, because you know the tabloids think I'm behind it, whoever was behind it, snitch, tell on them, right? Since y'all think I'm behind it, tell on them. When you turn yourself in, tell on them, snitch on them, because what you did was wrong. That's what I would tell them. Anybody else?
Will you continue to help people in your church going forward with investments or any other type of advice or guidance financially?
So I separate myself from my church, right? So it's not like I help my church do any investments, all right? I've never done that, okay? But what I do is I teach free classes. That's what I do. I teach free classes, classes that will cost you $5,000. I teach free classes of real estate and how to invest and what to invest. So please don't be bamboozled of how people turn things around. But it's not something that I get into the pulpit and try to teach my church. This is a separate thing. I don't force my church into what they don't want to be in. I teach you the instruments and the ways of whatever I know. And it's up to you to decide. So I'm going to take two more questions. And
I have a question.
yeah.
How did you feel
what was going through your mind when you was on the ground and that gun was in your back? I want to know everything that was going through your mind.
Well, what was going through my mind? I was helpless.
Were you praying? What was going on
I got it.
in that moment?
Yes. I was helpless, but prayer got me through. Right? I was looking at my daughter with a gun. I don't know what type of gun, but it was black. In her face. 8 months old. And daddy could not save her because if I moved, a lot of lives could have been gone. I saw my church, all of my deaconess boys, because they was in white for communion, all on the floor, on top of each other. A pastor with his head down, looking, a shepherd, looking, hurting, feeling helpless, can't do nothing. For people that trust me to lead them. And then y'all trying to beat me up? What about my church? If y'all don't like me, don't follow me. But what about my church? What about the women that's crying, that's calling me? What about my church? It's not about me.
And what do you think? Do legal disputes automatically undermine a leader's credibility? Or should faith and finance be judged separately? Because once the courtroom enters the narrative, the story is no longer just spiritual. It's structural. Chapter 5. When power loses its composure. Power doesn't usually collapse quietly. It slips in moments of emotion, impulse, and exposure, when the mask can no longer hold. Up to this point, the story has been about systems, image, persuasion, money, and pressure. But eventually, pressure stops being theoretical. It becomes personal. And when that happens, people reveal how they truly understand power. This chapter is about those moments. Pause here for a second, because what you're about to hear isn't about accusations. It's about behavior. As scrutiny intensified and legal pressure mounted, the environment around Bishop Lamor Whitehead became tense. Attention was constant. Criticism was louder. Trust was fractured. And when authority feels threatened, leaders respond in one of two ways: restraint or domination. What followed showed which path was chosen. During a church service, another live-streamed moment unfolded, one that couldn't be edited, reframed, or delayed. Two women entered the church, words were exchanged, tension escalated, and suddenly, the bishop was physically involved in removing one of them. The camera didn't look away. That moment spread almost as fast as the robbery footage had months earlier. And once again, public reaction split. Supporters argued he was protecting his family. Critics saw something else entirely: a display of control, not care. Be honest with yourself. When you saw that clip, what did it look like to you? Because perception matters. A leader who teaches humility is judged differently than one who teaches dominance. A leader who claims peace is measured against peace under pressure. And pressure exposes instinct. This incident wasn't just controversial because of what happened. It was controversial because of where it happened. Inside a church, during a sermon, in front of congregants, and on camera. Churches are supposed to be spaces of safety. Authority figures are expected to de-escalate, not physically engage. That contradiction is powerful. And it raised a question many viewers couldn't ignore. If this is how power is exercised publicly, what does it look like privately? Pause here. This question is uncomfortable, but necessary. Law enforcement became involved. Arrests were made. Statements followed. And once again, the narrative split. The bishop framed himself as a victim of unfair treatment, of targeting, of humiliation. He emphasized how quickly he was detained, how visible the incident was, and how it impacted his family. That framing resonated with supporters. Because victimhood is a powerful shield, but to critics, the framing felt familiar. It mirrored earlier responses to lawsuits, to scrutiny, to questions. Responsibility was externalized. Motives were questioned. Systems were blamed. And when the same defense appears in every crisis, people start noticing the pattern. Comment below. Do you think leaders should be held to a higher standard when emotions run high? Here's what matters most about this chapter. This wasn't about guilt or innocence. Courts handle that. This was about composure. Because composure reveals how someone views authority. Is authority something to serve with, or something to enforce with? When pressure rises, leaders who see themselves as servants usually slow down. They de-escalate. They protect the space. Leaders who see authority as dominance tend to escalate. They assert. They control. And that difference changes how people feel. Not just about the moment, but about the entire story. After this incident, something shifted. Doubt became louder. Silence became suspicion. People who once stayed quiet started speaking, not loudly, not publicly, but enough to matter. And that's the beginning of erosion. Erosion doesn't happen all at once. It happens through small cracks, through moments that don't align with the image, through behavior that contradicts the message. This moment was one of those cracks, because once people see authority lose composure, the illusion of certainty fades. And certainty was the foundation of everything. Let me ask you something. If someone preaches control over life, finances, and faith, what does it mean when they lose control in public? That question doesn't go away. It lingers. And lingering questions are dangerous for image-based leadership. As coverage continued, the story expanded beyond individual incidents. It became about temperament, about pattern, about power under stress. The bishop continued preaching, continued posting, continued defending himself. But something was different now. The reactions weren't the same. The applause was quieter. The comments were divided. The certainty was gone. Once belief fractures, it doesn't fully return. This chapter marks the moment when the narrative stopped being about isolated events and started becoming about character. And character is harder to defend than image. In the next chapter, we're going to step back and examine the larger pattern, how controversy, victim narratives, and attention cycles can actually extend influence even as credibility erodes. If you're following this story closely, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next chapter. This is where the psychology behind scandal becomes impossible to ignore. And what do you think? Was this moment about protection, or was it about control? Because how you answer that question changes how the rest of this story looks. Chapter 6, When Scandal Becomes Fuel. Here's the part most people don't understand. Scandal doesn't always end influence. Sometimes it multiplies it. By the time the story reached this chapter, something strange had happened. The controversies were public. The questions were loud. The footage was everywhere. And yet, the platform didn't disappear. It adapted. Pause here for a moment, because this pattern explains far more than one individual. In most people's minds, exposure leads to consequences. Truth comes out, trust collapses, and influence fades. But that's only true when influence is built on credibility. When influence is built on identity, scandal behaves differently. It hardens loyalty. For supporters who had already invested emotionally, spiritually, or financially, the controversy didn't feel like correction. It felt like attack. And when people feel attacked, they don't reconsider. They defend. This is where the us versus them dynamic fully takes shape. Critics aren't just critics anymore. They become enemies. Journalists aren't investigators. They're persecutors. Former supporters aren't victims. They're traitors. Once that framing locks in, evidence stops mattering. Think about this honestly. Have you ever doubled down on a belief just because you felt judged for holding it? That's not weakness. That's psychology. In moments of scandal, leaders who understand this shift lean into it. They don't calm the situation. They intensify it. Because intensity keeps attention focused inward. The language changes. This is spiritual warfare. They're trying to silence me. If they hated me, they'll hate you too. Those phrases do something powerful. They transform doubt into danger. Now questioning isn't neutral, it's risky. And when questioning feels risky, silence spreads. Comment below. Do you think controversy makes people think more critically or more defensively? At the same time, scandal brings something else: visibility. Algorithms don't distinguish between admiration and outrage. They only measure engagement. And scandal creates engagement at scale. Clips get shared. Reaction videos multiply. Comment sections explode. New audiences discover the figure not because they agree, but because they're curious. And curiosity is oxygen. For someone whose platform thrives on attention, scandal isn't always a threat. It's a signal boost. This is where many people get confused. They ask, why is this person still relevant? The answer is simple. Relevance doesn't require trust. It requires attention. And attention was now guaranteed. Another shift happens during this phase. The victim narrative solidifies. Every setback becomes proof of persecution. Every legal issue becomes confirmation of targeting. Every confrontation becomes evidence of survival. And to loyal followers, this narrative feels empowering. It reframes struggle as significance. You're not being attacked because you're wrong. You're being attacked because you're chosen. That idea is intoxicating because it turns discomfort into validation. It gives meaning to chaos. And it protects belief from collapse. But there's a cost. The more a leader frames themselves as a victim, the less responsibility they can accept without breaking the story. Accountability becomes incompatible with identity. Pause here and think about this. Can someone truly grow if every challenge is blamed on external forces? This phase also explains why some followers become louder, not quieter. They post more. They defend harder. They argue aggressively, because defending the leader feels like defending themselves. By now, belief isn't just belief. It's identity. And identity doesn't surrender easily. But while scandal can fuel influence in the short term, it quietly erodes something deeper: credibility with the outside world. Institutions don't respond to narratives. Courts don't respond to framing. Systems don't care about loyalty. And that's where the long-term consequences begin. Because while supporters rally, structures tighten, scrutiny increases, pressure builds behind the scenes, and the gap between the public story and private reality widens. This chapter is important because it explains why collapse doesn't happen immediately. It happens slowly. The audience narrows. The tone sharpens. The defenses repeat. The explanations loop. Eventually, the platform still exists, but it's no longer growing. It's just sustaining itself on loyalty. And loyalty without trust is fragile. Let me ask you something. If a leader needs constant conflict to stay relevant, what happens when the conflict ends? Because that's the question looming over this story. Scandal can protect influence temporarily, but it also traps it. Once a leader becomes defined by controversy, they can't return to normalcy. Peace doesn't trend. Stability doesn't excite. Only conflict keeps the engine running, and engines like that burn fast. In the next chapter, we're going to look at the other side of this equation, the people left behind, the followers who quietly disengage, the ones who don't comment, don't argue, and don't defend, the ones who simply disappear. If this analysis is helping you understand how influence actually works, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what comes next. This is where the story turns human. And what do you think? Does scandal expose the truth, or does it just rearrange who's willing to believe it? Because how you answer that question determines how stories like this continue or finally end. Chapter 7. The Silent Fall. Who pays when belief breaks? Not every collapse is loud. Some happen quietly, one person at a time, far away from cameras and comment sections. By the time scandals reach public awareness, most of the damage has already been done. Headlines focus on the leader, the controversy, the spectacle. But the real cost of stories like this is paid by people whose names never trend and whose voices rarely get heard. This chapter isn't about the figure at the center. It's about everyone orbiting him. Pause here for a moment, because this is the part most documentaries skip. When influence is built on belief, the fallout doesn't look like outrage. It looks like silence. People don't storm out. They fade away. They stop attending. They stop commenting. They stop asking questions. They disappear quietly, often without confrontation. And silence hides damage. For many followers, the realization doesn't come from one dramatic moment. It comes slowly. A promise that didn't happen. A message that stopped getting answered. A feeling that something wasn't right, even if they couldn't explain why. That internal conflict is brutal. Because leaving isn't just leaving a leader. It's leaving a community, a belief system, sometimes even family and friends who are still invested. Think about this honestly. How hard would it be for you to walk away from something you defended publicly? For some people, the cost wasn't just emotional, it was financial. Money given in trust, savings transferred with hope, resources offered under the belief that they were participating in something meaningful. When those expectations collapse, shame often follows. Not anger, shame. People blame themselves for believing, for not questioning sooner, for wanting hope badly enough to ignore warning signs. That shame keeps many from speaking out. And when people don't speak out, patterns repeat. This is why high-control environments thrive. They don't just persuade people to give, they persuade people to stay quiet when things go wrong. Comment below. Do you think silence protects people, or does it protect systems? Another unseen cost is faith itself. For some followers, disappointment doesn't stop with a leader. It spills into spirituality. They begin questioning everything. Prayer feels hollow. Community feels unsafe. Trust feels dangerous. This is one of the most devastating outcomes, because when belief is misused, rebuilding it can take years, if it happens at all. And yet, this damage rarely enters public conversation. It's too quiet, too personal, too uncomfortable. Instead, attention stays locked on the figure at the center, what he says next, what he posts next, what controversy follows. But behind the scenes, people are rebuilding from scratch. Some leave religion entirely. Some isolate themselves. Some carry the experience like a secret they don't know how to explain. And that's the real fallout. Let's pause here and be clear. Not every follower is naive. Not every supporter is blind. Many are simply human, looking for guidance, certainty, or stability in uncertain lives. That doesn't make them foolish. It makes them vulnerable. And vulnerability is always the entry point. This chapter matters because it reframes the story. It shifts focus away from spectacle and toward consequence, away from performance and toward people. Because systems built on persuasion don't just collapse upward, they collapse downward. Families argue, friendships fracture, trust erodes quietly, and once trust is damaged at this level, it's hard to repair. Another detail that rarely gets discussed is how exits happen. People don't announce they're leaving. They test the waters first. They pull back slowly. They stop engaging. They wait to see if things improve. And when nothing changes, they leave quietly, often without closure. That lack of closure lingers. Questions remain unanswered. Promises remain unresolved. And without acknowledgement, people are left to process everything alone. This isolation compounds the harm. Ask yourself this: if a system doesn't allow people to leave openly, what does that say about the system? Over time, the audience changes. What remains is a smaller, more loyal group, people who stayed not because doubts disappeared, but because leaving felt too costly. And that's not faith. That's entrapment. It's important to say this clearly. Criticism of systems like this isn't an attack on belief. It's a defense of it. Because belief should empower people, not trap them. By the time stories like this reach later chapters, the damage is already spread thin across dozens, sometimes hundreds of lives. And yet, those stories rarely get told. That's why this chapter exists. If you've ever trusted someone who let you down, you already understand this part of the story. If this breakdown resonates with you, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the final chapters. The ending of this story isn't about exposure. It's about understanding patterns so they don't repeat. And what do you think? Is the greatest harm of these stories financial loss, or the loss of trust that follows? Because in the next chapter, we're stepping back to expose the full pattern, how stories like this repeat across cultures, platforms, and generations.